The Snowfield in Vermont. Prologue, where winter refuses to be silent. At the far edge of America, where the hills roll like the backs of beasts slumbering under snow, there lies a land where winter seems to never pass. Vermont. The name alone brings to mind brown wooden cabins, crimson maples in late autumn, and then endless white fields stretching all the way to the horizon. Life moves slowly there. Time drifts by as if even it hesitates with each falling flake. Every footprint left in the snow feels like a trace of memory, of meetings long forgotten, and of words that never made it into sentences. They say that in the heart of that endless winter, there's a field where the snow falls deepest, and for as long as anyone can remember, a small wooden chair has always sat in the center of that white expanse. No one knows who placed it there. No one knows why, in that empty stretch of land, there's always a single path leading to the chair, as if someone once waited there for something or someone. And then one day a man returns, after 15 years away, after other winters, after trains without return dates. He comes back when nothing is certain anymore. Nothing except that the snow still falls, and that a letter, unsigned, sent from somewhere forgotten, found him. The field is still waiting. Snow falls every night. Fell. The snowfield in Vermont is a story of return, not just to a place, but to everything that was never truly left behind. Of someone still waiting, and someone who once promised to come back, but was forever lost between winters with no way out. This is a story to be told late at night, when everything outside is quiet, and something inside you still aches with words unspoken. A story for anyone who has ever loved and let go. The night train back to Greenvale. The train slowed as it rolled through the mist-draped forests of Vermont. The iron wheels screeched against the rails, making a sound both old and familiar, like a forgotten melody repeating in the minds of those who've waited too long. The snow didn't fall heavily, but steadily, as if the sky were whispering something down to the white-covered earth. Elias Monroe sat by the window of the last car, eyes fixed on the passing scenery. His face was thin, and his eyes were shadowed, not just from exhaustion, but perhaps something deeper, an old dream that still refused to let go. He wore a worn wool coat, a gray scarf wrapped around his neck, and clutched a small suitcase, the only thing he carried besides the past. There were only a few other passengers left on the train. An old woman cradled a cat in her lap. A young man read by the light of a small flashlight. A young couple leaned into each other, asleep in a world untouched by worry. But Elias was different. He couldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not for many years now. 15 years earlier, he had left Greenvale on a day colder than this one. Back then, he was a 27-year-old man with the kind of hope that made the world seem larger than any snowfield he'd ever known. He left with dreams and promises, one in particular that he never kept, to come back when winter ended. But that winter lasted longer than he'd imagined. The train eased to a stop at Greenvale Station, the smallest stop on the Northern Line. Just a simple wooden building and a single flickering yellow lamp swaying in the wind. The station master was an old man in a red knit cap, tall and thin. His name was Hank Raleigh, the last person in town who still remembered Elias from boyhood. Monroe. Hank squinted, his voice rough from cigarettes and time. Well, I'll be. You still remember the way home? Elias smiled faintly, gave a small nod. I'm surprised I still remember the name Greenvale. Hank reached for Elias's suitcase, setting it gently on the snow-dusted platform. The field's still there, but no one clears the path anymore. Everything's older now. Elias glanced north, where dark pine silhouettes waited in the distance. Is someone still living in that house? Every now and then I see smoke from the chimney, Hank said slowly. Could be Laurel. Could just be memories. Elias said nothing. He took back his suitcase and walked beneath the lonely station lamp, leaving the first set of footprints on the untouched snow. The road back to the old farm wound through a forest of maple and pine, branches heavy with snow. Fence posts peeked through the drift like traces of a world that once was, and had long since been buried. He stopped at the final bend, where the hand-carved Monroe Farm sign once stood. His father had made it out of pine years ago. Now only 2 rotting posts remained. But Elias didn't need a sign. He had memorized this land long ago. When the house came into view through the bare branches, his heart pounded. A light, one small window still glowed warm and soft, like a candle burning low in the night. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney, leaning south with the wind. Elias stood at the steps, unable to knock. His chest tightened. A dog barked faintly from inside, strangely familiar. And then, the door opened. A woman stood there, hair loose around her shoulders, a wine-colored sweater, arms holding a white-furred dog that once belonged to Elias's mother. That face older now, touched by time but unmistakably Laurel, the girl he once promised to take away from this town, only to leave without keeping his word. Elias! Her voice was soft, like the first breeze of winter. He stood there, snow clinging to his coat, suitcase still in hand like a child unsure whether to enter or turn back. You came back, Laurel said gently. No blame, no anger, just a simple truth, spoken as if she'd always known the story would lead back to this moment. And so began the first night of the last winter. What remains inside the cabin? Elias stepped across the threshold like a stranger, though he had once lived here for more than 20 years of his life. The inside of the cabin was almost unchanged. The earth-toned wool rug still lay slightly askew beneath the armchair. The oak table still bore the same childhood scratches from when he was small. On the mantel above the fireplace, a faded photograph. His father, his mother, and himself, towhead and grinning wide during his first snowy winter. Only one thing was different: the silence. Not the kind of silence that fills an abandoned house, but the kind born from time. Like every sound that had ever existed here had been carefully packed away and stored in a corner no one dared to open. Laurel set the kettle on the wood stove, the red glow of the fire lighting up her cheeks, casting a soft halo, like the ghosts of memories Elias had tried to forget. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't ask why he came back now. They just sat there, a wooden table between them, hands wrapped around steaming cups of tea, as if 15 years had passed by like a breeze brushing across the porch. "I left everything just the way it was," Laurel said, her voice still holding the same gentle cadence as before. "Your room's still upstairs. Every year I went up to dust it off, just to make sure it was still there." Elias pressed his lips together, eyes on the fire. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said softly. "Laurel's the only one who stayed. Don't you remember?" She smiled lightly, but her voice held the weight of something folded too many times, each crease a year of wordless waiting. "I stayed away longer than I meant to," Elias admitted. "When I left Greenvale, I thought a few springs would be enough to figure out who I was." Laurel knew. He looked up at her. She wasn't blaming him. She wasn't forgiving him either. It was simply a truth spoken out loud, like she had understood long ago and stayed anyway. "There were days I thought I'd forgotten," she went on, pouring more water into his cup. "But every time winter came again, every snowfall on the field, it reminded me that everything was still waiting." Elias reached across the table, hesitant. "The letter, that was you?" Laurel nodded. "Just once. I wasn't even sure where you were. But if you still remembered the way back, I figured you'd understand." The house fell quiet. Wind whistled through the old window frames, causing the firelight to flicker. The crackling of the wood sounded like the irregular heartbeat of a heart that had waited too long. "I'm not asking to be forgiven," Elias said, "but I need to know, why did you still wait?" Laurel looked at him for a long time, then answered with a single sentence Elias would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Because some people, when they leave, you just know they're coming back, sooner or later, even if the snow buries every road home." That night, Elias slept in his old room. Low ceiling, dark wooden walls. The scent of snow mixed with the smell of old books and long-lost youth. He lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, listening to the wind and Laurel's footsteps downstairs, like the steady rhythm of a home that had never fully gone quiet. Inside him, something old began to thaw, not just because he had come back, but because this place and this person had still been waiting just the same. And when the morning light broke through the frost-blurred glass, Elias Monroe knew that this winter would not be like any winter before. The old field and the old promise. The next morning there was no sunlight, Snow still fell softly, like thin specks of dust, swirling in the wind and touching every surface with a quiet, almost sacred stillness. Elias awoke in the faint light filtering through the ivory curtains. The room was still the same room. The dark wooden walls, the desk by the window with a knife-scarred L carved into it that he had once hidden away at 16 as a secret of his own. Everything was still there, but he was no longer the boy he had once been. Downstairs, Laurel was preparing breakfast. The smell of baking and coffee lightly filled the air. A small radio played in the kitchen corner, AM waves from the local station. The voice of the old radio announcer with rural news and weather reports, looping like the heartbeat of this land. Just a simple breakfast, Laurel said as he descended the stairs. I'm not sure if you're still used to the way we eat here. No, I missed the taste of the coffee in this kitchen, Elias replied, sitting across from her. And the dim light like it's about to snow heavily. Laurel smiled quietly, her gaze drifting out the window. Would you like to go out to the field? She asked. Elias hesitated. His hands trembled slightly on his coffee cup, as if that question was a door he wasn't yet ready to open. But then he nodded slowly, as if he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to return there. They walked down the narrow path leading through the forest. Snow blanketed both sides of the trail, but the footprints of Laurel, year after year, had formed a familiar path. She walked ahead, her steps sure, as though she had never left. Elias followed quietly, his eyes on her figure, small and bundled in a thick coat, wearing a hand-knit woolen hat that he guessed she had made herself. Then the forest opened up, revealing the field. A pale gray sky stretched above, the snow pure as an untouched canvas. Pristine, endless white, so silent that Elias could hear the wind brushing through the distant branches. In the middle of the field it was still there, the old wooden chair. Its backrest was slightly tilted, the seat covered with a thin layer of snow. Around it was a circle of snow that had been cleared, clear evidence that someone still came to sit here. Elias stopped a few paces away. His throat tightened. How long? Have you been coming here? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Laurel doesn't count anymore, she replied, stepping closer to the chair and gently brushing the snow from the wooden seat. There were winters with a lot of snow, and I sat here until it got dark. Some winters, I only stood and looked from afar. Elias slowed his pace, his footsteps sinking into the thick snow, leaving deep impressions as though each step carried the weight of the past. You promised, Laurel said softly, that when the field was covered in snow you would come back. I thought that promise would melt away with the first winter. But then the snow came again the next year. And you were still here, Elias said, his eyes on the empty chair. I left, not knowing what I was leaving behind. No one really knows, Laurel smiled sadly. But sometimes, we don't need to know. We just need to believe. She sat on the chair, patting the empty space beside her. Elias sat next to her, both of them looking out at the endless white before them. The wind blew through their hair, carrying the whispers of old snowfalls, the voice of time. This field, Elias said softly, has kept everything we never said. And now, Laurel replied, we can start again, if you want to. Elias didn't answer right away, but he gently squeezed her hand. Not too tightly, just enough to let her know he had heard, and he was here. Finally, he was here. That afternoon, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in 15 years, in that pristine field, two sets of footprints walked side by side. Under the old porch, the trip to the field didn't last long. By the time they returned to the old wooden house, the snow had fallen thicker, covering the ground with a fresh white layer, like a new blanket. However, inside Elias, there was a strange warmth, like he had found something he had long been afraid to touch. Laurel led him inside, where the fire in the hearth still burned, creating a cozy space amidst the cold winter air. She motioned for him to sit down, pouring him another cup of hot tea. This time there were no rushed words. They both knew that there was nothing more to explain. All they needed to do was sit in silence and let the days that had passed find their way back. Elias looked around, his eyes lingering on the old wooden table, where he had once sat studying, where his mother had often prepared simple meals, and where his father had sat reading the newspaper each morning. The old keepsakes seemed unchanged, but in his eyes, everything was different. After a simple dinner, they sat by the fire, Laurel reclining in the old armchair, while Elias sat across from her, watching the flames dance. "Do you want to see your room again?" Laurel asked, when the quiet had stretched longer than usual. Elias hesitated for a moment before nodding. He didn't want to feel like a guest in this house, but perhaps it was time for him to face what had been left behind. His room upstairs was still intact, just as he had left it. The small room with familiar objects, a wooden bed, a rough-hewn desk, and an armchair with faded upholstery. A small painting of Vermont's landscape hung on the wall. He stepped to the desk, where some old, musty books lay, along with scraps of paper full of hasty, scribbled lines, words he had written as a young dreamer, imagining new horizons. As he bent down, something small fell out of one of the thick books, bouncing off the floor. Elias picked it up, and it was a letter. The letter was unopened, its envelope old, with the name Laurel written in slanted handwriting on the front. He stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the letter. 15 years ago, he had left without ever reading it. He had forgotten it existed, perhaps because he didn't want to know what was inside. But now, this letter felt like a key, unlocking the door to the past. "Did you write me a letter?" he whispered, but as if only to himself. Laurel stood in the doorway, watching him with a gentle gaze. You never read it. I know because I never sent it. Elias turned around, his eyes meeting Laurel's, and then he opened the letter, reading each line carefully. Elias, no matter where you go or what you do, I will always hope you'll come back. Don't forget that there will always be a home here waiting for you, and one person who has always longed to see you return. I won't wait in vain. I love you forever, Laurel. As he finished reading, Elias felt a lump form in his throat. The letter was not just words on paper. It was everything left unsaid, a weight that had never been answered. And now, as he stood here before her, the letter carried a different weight. Laurel stepped into the room, saying nothing, but her gaze seemed to speak volumes. She didn't need to explain, didn't need to apologize, didn't need to recount why she hadn't sent the letter. They had both lived through so many years, and perhaps words were no longer necessary. Elias tucked the letter into his coat pocket and turned back to her. You know, he said softly, I hurt you. Laurel shook her head gently. You didn't do anything. It's just, I understand that some things can't last forever. But I don't regret it, Elias. A silence stretched between them. Elias moved closer to her, feeling the warmth of her presence. He wanted to say something, but couldn't. Maybe no words were needed anymore. Only the crackling fire in the hearth, and the soft sound of snow falling outside the window. It was the only sound left of all that remained, the things he had never said, and all they had been through together. As night fell, they sat together by the fire. There was a peace, as if the snowstorm outside was merely part of an unfinished story. Maybe, Laurel began, her eyes on the flames. One day, this field won't be a place for waiting anymore. But before that, I want you to know that I've always believed in that promise. Elias smiled quietly. He didn't need to say anything more. They were here in this moment, and that was enough. And when the night fell, the snowy field outside was no longer a place for waiting. It had become a place for memories that had returned, nurtured in the quiet and love that had never faded. The last night on the snowy field. The night had fallen, and the snow continued to fall steadily, gently, blanketing the entire space. Laurel and Elias sat together by the fire. The flames crackled, their golden sparks shimmering like small stars, reflecting in their eyes, adding to the silence that surrounded them. Laurel didn't know what to say. All night long, she had wondered if she had done the right thing by waiting, if it had been wrong to hold on to so much, for so long. But today, everything seemed to be slowly falling into its rightful place, like the snowy field outside, all covered by a fresh layer of snow. Elias felt the heaviness in the air, but he didn't rush to find an explanation. Maybe all they needed was a moment like this, in the quiet of the night, when silence could speak volumes. Can I take a walk for a bit? And she too needed time to face something she had long been afraid to confront. They stepped outside, not in a hurry, just silently walking along the snow-covered path. No one else was on this field, just the wind, the snow, and the stillness of the night. The snow fell softly like an instrumental melody, enveloping everything. First, it was the sound of their footsteps in the snow. Slowly, steadily, as if they both knew exactly where they were headed. But when they looked up at the dark sky, they saw nothing but thick white clouds blocking the moonlight. Elias stopped, looking into the distance. Far ahead, the field stretched out, covered in snow. "I've left behind so much," he said, his voice low, as if speaking more to himself than to Laurel. "I left behind things I couldn't face, and I left you too." Laurel didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, feeling the chill of the night settle on her shoulders. "You didn't have to leave, Elias. You left, but you never truly went away. You just needed time to figure out who you are." "And what about you?" Elias asked, turning to look at her. "How long have you been waiting?" "It wasn't waiting, it was believing," she replied, her gaze gentle yet firm. "Believing that no matter what, we would find each other. No matter how many winters passed." They both stood in silence under the night sky, no need for more words. Indeed, the winter had passed, and the snow would never cover what truly belonged to them. After a while, Elias turned back to look at the house. "Did we do the right thing, Laurel? Is it time to let everything return to how it was?" Laurel looked at him, not rushing to answer. "We can't go back to the past, Elias, but we can create the future, if you want." Elias remained silent, and then finally he nodded. He understood that there was no changing what had been. But there was one thing he was sure of. If he stayed, if he truly wanted to stay, then it wasn't too late. And no matter how long winter lasted, spring would be waiting. "You're right," he whispered. "We can create a new future. And this time I won't leave." Laurel smiled softly, her eyes glowing like stars in the night. She didn't need any more explanations. She just needed to know that, in the end, they had come back to each other. And no matter how long the snow would fall, they would always be a part of each other. They turned back to the house, walking past the path that had once been marked with their footprints, and returned to the warmth of the hearth. Elias sat beside Laurel, no longer hesitating like before. They sat in silence, but there was no need to say anything more. They knew that, in the end, they had found each other, and nothing could change that. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, but now, it was no longer cold. It was just part of a story yet to be finished, and a love that had never faded. And as winter passed, they knew spring would come. That was the promise of the snowy field, and the promise of the people who had found each other again after all these years. New endings. Winter no longer brought a sense of coldness, but rather a gentleness. The thin layers of snow that covered the ground felt like a soft blanket, as if protecting everything in the old wooden house. Meanwhile, Elias and Laurel slowly found their own path, not rushing, but with unwavering determination. They began each new day together. Every morning, as the snow fell outside the window, it reminded them that, no matter how many winters passed, they were still here, together. The unhurried conversations, the early mornings when the first golden light of spring began to creep through the doorframe, were small moments, but moments full of meaning. One morning, when the sunlight was just enough to illuminate the space in the room, Laurel stood up and walked outside. Elias watched her, then slowly rose and walked to the window. His eyes gazed toward the snow-covered field, which had begun to fade, now replaced by patches of fresh green grass sprouting through the melting snow. "What have you been thinking about all this time?" Elias asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. Laurel turned around, her eyes lighting up. "I've been thinking about the things we haven't done yet, about the places we haven't explored. I've been thinking about all the years we've missed. But I also think that sometimes, not everything we want needs to happen immediately. We need time." "I think so too," Elias smiled. "We can't change the past, but perhaps we can build the future. And maybe that future isn't a long road, but small, steady steps." Laurel looked at him, saying nothing, but the gentle smile on her lips was answer enough. The next day, they walked along the path together, but this time, it wasn't to search for something from the past. It was to rebuild what had been missed. The path, though not long, was an entire journey for them. When they reached the end of the trail, they stopped, standing next to an old maple tree. Elias gently placed his hand on its trunk, feeling its strength. Despite the many seasons of rain and sun it had endured, this maple tree might be a testament to resilience, he said. Despite all the changes, it still stands there. And so do we, Laurel replied. No matter how many challenges, we will remain strong. They stood there for a long while, no need for further words. Everything was already clear. Love, resilience, and belief in a future that had never dimmed. Back at the house, Elias and Laurel began making plans for small but meaningful changes. Plans for the coming spring, long-term goals for their new life. They tidied up the old garden, planted new plants, and redecorated the room where they often sat and talked. Everything seemed to come to life again. Elias had decided that he wouldn't return to the city, at least not right now. He realized that this place, the snowy field and the old wooden house, was where he truly belonged. And Laurel felt the same. She no longer had to worry about seeking the unknown, because now she knew that what she needed was already here, in this house, and in the simple moments shared with Elias. One weekend evening, they sat together, the golden light from the oil lamp filling the room with warmth. "I don't think I need to go anywhere anymore," Elias said, his eyes looking straight at her. Vermont will always be my home, and you are a part of that home. Laurel smiled softly, her eyes sparkling. Then we will build a new home together, not just in material things, but in a life full of memories. That night, they sat by the fire, talking about their plans for the future, not rushing, not pressured, just simply enjoying the peaceful moments together. Spring finally arrived. The first flowers began to bloom, and the birds returned. The snowy field was no longer there, but the footprints of Elias and Laurel remained, deeply imprinted in the earth. Their steps had written a new story, a story not about what had been lost, but about what was beginning. And so, the snowy field was no longer just a part of the past. It had become a part of the present story, a part of the memories being written day by day. And when spring came, they understood that sometimes you don't have to search for a new beginning. Sometimes all it takes is returning to where you started, and from there building a solid future. That's enough.